The grand and illustrious Galactic Confederacy had conquered the stars with mathematics so complex it would make Einstein weep into his equations. Their ships traversed the cosmos with the casual indifference of a teenager scrolling through social media, and their weapons could rearrange the atomic structure of entire planets, a fact they were insufferably proud of and mentioned at every interstellar cocktail party. Yet here they were, the most advanced civilization in 3 spiral arms, hovering above a backwater planet called Earth, with their metaphorical tails between their metaphorical legs. You want to recruit? One of them? Admiral Zextoral's epidermis shifted through 17 shades of disbelief, finally settling on a nauseating chartreuse. His 3 primary eyes blinked asynchronously, a clear sign of distress among the Vexillian species. The bipeds who still think digital watches are pretty neat? High Commander Vrelk made a sound that, translated across species barriers, approximated a long-suffering sigh. The Kri'zz swarm has adapted to every weapon in our arsenal. 18 colonies lost, 3 battle fleets annihilated. Our tactical algorithms give us a 2.7% chance of survival without unconventional intervention. But humans? The science minister's tendrils coiled in what could only be described as intellectual indigestion. They spend half their computational capacity on videos of juvenile felines. Their most advanced propulsion system would barely qualify as a trash disposal unit on our vessels. And yet, Vrelk's voice dropped to a quiet rumble, they have perfected the art of destroying things in ways that defy logical prediction. The anthropological division calls it thinking outside the box, though why thinking requires a box remains unclear. The strategic chamber fell silent, save for the ambient hum of quantum processors recalculating their increasingly dismal odds of survival. Holographic projections displayed the advancing Kri'zz swarm, a seething mass of crystalline structures that devoured all matter, converting it into more of themselves with ruthless efficiency. The human military specialist arrives in one rotation, Vrelk finally announced, mandibles clicking with finality. Intelligence suggests they are expert in something called asymmetric warfare, which appears to involve winning conflicts when possessing inferior technology and resources. How does one win with inferior everything? Admiral Zextoral genuinely couldn't process the concept, his species having evolved through pure technological superiority for 30 million years. That, said Vrelk, is precisely what we need to find out. Lieutenant Kri'zz drew the short probability strand, and thus had the dubious honor of greeting the human representative. As the transport shuttle docked with the flagship inevitable mathematical conclusion, Kri'zz mentally reviewed the briefing materials on human biological requirements: atmospheric nitrogen-oxygen mix, moderate temperatures, periodic ingestion of organic matter, and peculiar social rituals involving the pressing together of appendages. The airlock cycled open, and out stepped a human of average dimensions according to the xenobiology database. It wore the blue and gold uniform of its planetary defense force, with decorative metallic symbols affixed to the shoulders and chest that presumably indicated some tribal standing. "Permission to come aboard?" the human asked, executing a bizarre motion involving the placement of one upper appendage against its cranial structure. "Permission? Granted," Kri'zz replied hesitantly, attempting to mirror the gesture and failing spectacularly. "I am Lieutenant Kri'zz, your liaison during this consultative period. You may address me by my full designation, Kri'zz Aleph 97 Delta Omicron Epsilon." The human's facial features contorted briefly before settling into what the database identified as a smile, though it bore unsettling resemblance to a threat display. "Just call me Lieutenant. Seems easier all around." "Very well, Lieutenant, just call me Lee, Lieutenant." The human made an odd rhythmic sound. Kri'zz's translator indicated it was laughter, though the xenopsychology database flagged it as potentially indicating either amusement or discomfort, a troubling ambiguity. As they navigated the luminescent corridors of the flagship, Kri'zz observed the human studying everything with keen interest. The specimen seemed particularly fascinated by the gravity manipulation fields and the bioorganic circuitry pulsing beneath translucent bulkheads. "Your ship," the human remarked, "makes our spacecraft look like we built them with stone tools and optimism." "Your assessment is only mildly hyperbolic," Kri'zz stated, unsure if this constituted appropriate conversational exchange. "Your species' fastest vessel would require approximately 73.4 standard years to reach our nearest outpost." The human's facial display shifted again. "And yet here I am, being escorted through a ship that could reduce my entire planet to cosmic dust because you need my help. Funny how the universe works, isn't it?" Kri'zz did not find it funny at all, but the database suggested humans often used rhetorical questions as social lubricant rather than genuine information-seeking behavior. They arrived at the central strategic chamber, where the High Command waited with varying degrees of skepticism etched into their diverse physiologies. The massive holographic display dominated the center, showing the inexorable advance of the Kri'zz swarm through the Cygnus arm. High Commander Vrelk rose from his gravitational suspension field. "Human specialist, welcome aboard the flagship of the Galactic Confederate Navy. I trust your transport was adequate?" "Beats economy class on any airline back home," the human replied, seemingly distracted by the holographic display. "So, that's the enemy. Looks like someone weaponized a diamond mine." Several members of the command staff exchanged confused glances, their translator implants struggling with the reference. Admiral Zextoral's epidermis rippled with impatience. "This is the Kri'zz Collective, a crystalline hive-mind entity that has consumed 3 star systems in the past 60 rotations. Our phase disruptors, quantum destabilizers, and even antimatter warheads have proven ineffective. The crystalline structure adapts to energy signatures within minutes of exposure." The human approached the hologram, studying it with narrowed ocular organs. "And you've tried hitting it. Really, really hard." The science minister's tendrils twisted into what xenolinguists would translate as the punctuation equivalent of multiple question marks. "Our kinetic impactors deliver energy equivalent to 18.3 of your nuclear weapons per second." "Ha." The human continued, circling the display. "And you've tried talking to it?" "It consumes communication arrays along with everything else," Vrelk explained, mandibles twitching with what might have been embarrassment. "We have exhausted all conventional and several hundred unconventional approaches." The human nodded slowly, then looked directly at Vrelk with an expression the database struggled to categorize. "Well then, looks like it's time for some properly unconventional thinking. On Earth we have a saying, sometimes you need a primitive solution to an advanced problem." Admiral Zextoral's epidermis flushed a deep ultraviolet. "Are we truly this desperate?" High Commander Vrok's compound eyes fixed on the advancing swarm in the holographic display. "Yes, Admiral, I believe we are." The human's face formed that disconcerting smile again. "Then let's get to work. I'll need access to your manufacturing facilities, raw materials, and a really, really big coffee machine. Trust me, where mathematics fails, sometimes good old human ingenuity succeeds." No one in the command chamber felt particularly reassured. The flagship's manufacturing bay resembled a cathedral built by beings who had transcended the concept of religion, vast, imposing, and humming with energies that made the humans' fillings tingle. Fabrication units capable of rearranging matter at the subatomic level stood idle, awaiting instruction from their new temporary commander. "So," the human said, slurping from a container of synthesized caffeine that the ship's molecular assembler had produced after 7 failed attempts, You folks can basically make anything, right? Chief Engineer PX Lawn's upper appendages moved in what might charitably be called a shrug, if shrugs involved 6 limbs moving in mathematically perfect opposition. The fabrication units can construct any device for which we possess sufficient theoretical understanding and material components. Great. Let's start with something simple. The human pulled out a primitive data storage device, an actual physical object that stored information through mechanical means rather than quantum entanglement. Several technicians leaned away as if it might bite. The human inserted the device into an adapter that Lieutenant Kri'zz had reluctantly fabricated. A series of crude diagrams appeared in the holographic field. "What?" asked Admiral Zextorol, who had insisted on overseeing this potential catastrophe personally. "Is that?" "That," the human said with inappropriate enthusiasm, "is our starting point." The room fell into shocked silence as the aliens processed what they were seeing. "This is a joke," the science minister finally concluded. "It must be. The human is attempting humor. I assure you, I'm being entirely serious." The human pointed at the diagram. "This is a kinetic delivery system that uses chemical propellant to accelerate a dense metallic projectile." "Ah, gum," Admiral Zextorol said, the translator struggling with the primitive concept. "You're proposing to fight a crystalline hive mind that has consumed 3 star systems with a projectile weapon." "Not just any projectile weapon," the human corrected, manipulating the diagram to zoom in on specific sections. "A really, really big one. With some modification." Chief Engineer PX Lawn's sensor stalks drooped in what appeared to be existential despair. "We abandoned such crude mechanisms before your species discovered agriculture." "Exactly." The human's enthusiasm remained undimmed. "And that's precisely why the Kri'zz won't be prepared for it. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways, especially when the old ways involve very large explosions." Over the next several cycles, the manufacturing bay transformed into what several crew members privately described as an archaeological dig through weapons history. The human directed the fabrication of components that the ship's AI struggled to categorize, occasionally making adjustments by hand, physically touching the materials, a practice that made several technicians emit distress pheromones. High Commander Vrelk observed the proceedings with growing concern. "The test is scheduled for the next rotation. The Admiralty Board will be present. Are you certain this apparatus will be functional?" The human looked up from where they were tinkering with a particularly ominous-looking cylinder. "Oh, it'll work. The question is whether your ship can handle the recoil." "Recoil?" Vlek's translator implant seemed to glitch on the unfamiliar concept. "You know Newton's third law, equal and opposite reaction?" The human made a pushing gesture with both hands. "When this thing fires, something's got to absorb the kickback." After a hurried consultation with the engineering team, modifications were made to the flagship's inertial dampening fields. The human watched with obvious amusement as the galaxy's most advanced engineers scrambled to accommodate a concept they hadn't considered in millennia. "Your species," Lieutenant Kri'zz observed during a rare break in the frantic preparations, "approaches problems in a most peculiar manner." The human nodded, watching as a team of robots assembled what looked like a primitive artillery piece the size of a small shuttle. "Where I come from, we call it lateral thinking. When you can't out-muscle a problem, you outthink it. But this solution appears to be entirely based on muscle," Kri'zz pointed out. "That's the beauty of it. Sometimes the smartest move is to do something so monumentally stupid that no one sees it coming." The human paused, noting Kri'zz's confused expression. "Let me put it this way. Your civilization has spent so long climbing the technological ladder that you've forgotten what the ground looks like. Sometimes you need to get your feet dirty. As the fabrication cycle neared completion, a delegation from the Admiralty Board arrived to inspect the humans' creation. The procession of distinguished military officials, bedecked in ceremonial fields of quantum probability and trailing clouds of status pheromones, came to an abrupt halt at the sight of the weapon. Grand Admiral Vrextool, whose lineage traced back to the founding of the Confederacy, stared at the construct with all 7 of his primary sensory organs. "This is primitive," he finally announced, the translator struggling to convey the depth of his disapproval. "Technically, yes," the human agreed cheerfully, "but sometimes primitive is exactly what you need." The apparatus resembled nothing so much as an ancient ship's cannon, grotesquely enlarged and modified, with components that seemed to belong to entirely different technological paradigms. Where elegant Confederacy weapons featured sleek, non-Euclidean geometries, this was all brutal angles and crude power. Several sections glowed with what appeared to be contained plasma, while others featured actual moving mechanical parts, a concept so archaic that several junior officers had to access historical databases to understand what they were seeing. "The test begins in 6 hours, Grand Admiral Vrextool announced. "For the sake of the Confederacy, I hope this contraption performs better than it looks." As the delegation departed in a cloud of skepticism, Chief Engineer PX Lorne turned to the human. "They don't believe this will work." "Good," the human replied, patting the massive barrel of the weapon with inexplicable affection. "The best victories are the ones no one sees coming." "And if it fails?" Exlorn asked. The human's expression shifted to something the database couldn't quite categorize. "Then we're no worse off than before. But trust me, this won't fail. We're just approaching the problem from a different angle." Literally. The final hours before the test were spent in feverish preparation. The human insisted on making multiple adjustments that baffled the engineering team, including the introduction of several components that appeared to serve no purpose, according to any known physical principles in the Confederacy's vast scientific archives. "What is this substance?" Lieutenant Kri'zz asked, pointing to a container of dark, viscous fluid that the human was carefully integrating into the weapon's feeding mechanism. "Let's just call it a special sauce," the human replied, with a wink that the translator flagged as potentially indicating either conspiracy or eye strain. As the weapon reached completion, High Commander Vrelk made one final inspection. "The fate of 18 colonies and potentially the entire Confederacy rests on this device," he said solemnly. "Are you absolutely certain it will perform as expected?" The human stepped back, admiring their creation with the expression of a proud parent. "Commander, if there's one thing humans know how to do, it's break things in spectacular and innovative ways. Tomorrow, your Admiralty is going to get a demonstration they'll never forget." Vrelp's compound eyes reflected the bizarre contraption. "That," he said with feeling, "is precisely what worries me." As the artificial night cycle descended on the flagship, the human insisted on sleeping near the weapon. Another biological peculiarity that the crew found both fascinating and slightly disturbing. Security feeds showed the human occasionally waking to make minor adjustments, muttering calculations that the ship's AI flagged as mathematically improbable but not demonstrably incorrect. In the officers' lounge, bets were placed on the outcome of the next day's test. The odds heavily favored spectacular failure, with a small but vocal minority wagering on catastrophic failure resulting in ship-wide destruction. Only Lieutenant Kri'zz, who had spent the most time observing the human at work, placed a modest bet on success. "Their methodology defies all logic," Kri'zz explained to skeptical colleagues, "yet there appears to be an underlying pattern to their madness. A method, if you will." As the ship's cycle edged toward morning, anticipation and dread hung in the recycled air like an impending storm. Tomorrow would determine whether the Confederacy had made the greatest strategic blunder in its history by trusting its survival to a species that had been splitting atoms for less time than most Confederacy citizens had been alive. The humans slept soundly beneath their creation, dreaming of home and explosions. The observation deck of the inevitable mathematical conclusion buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt since the ship's maiden voyage. A full quorum of the Admiralty Board occupied the tiered seating, their diverse physiologies unified by a single emotion, barely disguised contempt. Holographic displays showed the test zone, a region of empty space deliberately seeded with a small Kri'zz fragment captured at great cost from the front lines. "Behold," Admiral Zextoral announced with theatrical mockery, "the salvation of the Confederacy." On the main viewer, the human's creation sat in the launching bay, looking absurdly out of place among the sleek Confederate technology, like a stone axe in a neutron microscope laboratory. The massive barrel gleamed dully under the bay's illumination, its crude angles and visible mechanical components causing several admirals to emit derisive pheromones. "Are we recording this?" asked Grand Admiral Vrextool. "Future tactical academies will study this moment as a lesson in desperation." High Commander Vrelk maintained a dignified silence, though his mandibles clicked nervously. Lieutenant Kreck stood at attention nearby, wondering if their career would survive the day. The human entered the frame, performing final checks on the weapon with methodical precision. Through the communication link, the observation deck could hear the human's running commentary. Propellant chambers loaded, targeting systems aligned, special modifications primed. We are go for demonstration. "At least the primitive seems confident," someone muttered, triggering a wave of nervous laughter. The human looked directly into the camera. "Distinguished members of the Admiralty, thank you for this opportunity. What you're about to witness may appear crude by your standards, but I assure you, appearances can be deceiving." Grand Admiral Vrextool's epidermis flushed with impatience. "Proceed with the demonstration." The human nodded, then pressed a sequence of actual physical buttons on the weapon's control panel. The massive barrel tilted slightly, orienting toward the test zone where the Kri'zz fragment floated, a jagged, crystalline structure, roughly the size of a small shuttle. "Target acquired," the human announced. "Firing in 3, 2, 1. The weapon discharged with a flash so bright that the observation deck's filters barely contained it. The recoil, despite the inertial dampeners, sent visible shockwaves through the launching bay. Several admirals instinctively ducked, a vestigial response their evolutionary lineages hadn't quite eliminated. All eyes turned to the test zone display. The Kri'zz fragment hung unchanged in space. Silence descended on the observation deck, followed by the rising murmur of vindicated skepticism. "As expected," Grand Admiral Vrexko intoned, 7 eyes blinking in synchronized disappointment. "A primitive solution to an advanced problem." "Wait," the human's voice cut through the growing chorus of dismissal. "Watch." On the display, something unexpected was happening. The projectile, barely visible as a speck against the void, had split apart mid-trajectory. What appeared to be a fine mist surrounded the Kri'zz fragment. "What trickery is this?" demanded the science minister, tendrils coiling with suspicion. The human's voice remained calm. "No tricks, just old-school physics with a modern twist." Before anyone could respond, the mist surrounding the Kri'zz fragment ignited. Not in a conventional explosion, but in a strange, rippling cascade of reactions that seemed to dance across the crystalline surface. Where the reaction touched, the perfect geometric structure began to deform. "Impossible," whispered the science minister, all 6 eye stalks extended in shock. "The crystal structure is rearranging. Indeed, the Kri'zz fragment was changing before their eyes. Its facets dulled, then began to crumble at the molecular level. Within moments, what had been a perfect crystalline threat was transforming into an amorphous cloud of inert particles. "What have you done?" Vralk asked, mandibles slack with astonishment. The human approached the camera, that unsettling smile spreading across their face. "I introduced the crystal to a little earth chemistry. The projectile contained a specially engineered molecular compound, what we might call a crystal cancer. It doesn't try to destroy the structure from the outside, which is why all your fancy energy weapons failed. Instead, it infiltrates the lattice and corrupts it from within, triggering a cascading reaction that makes the crystal deconstruct itself." The observation deck erupted in a cacophony of exclamations, questions, and demands for explanation in at least 17 different communication modalities. Grand Admiral Vrextul raised all 7 limbs for silence. "Explain the primitive delivery mechanism. Surely our advanced deployment systems could deliver this agent more efficiently." The humans shook their head. "That's the beauty of it. Your advanced delivery systems are all detected and countered by the Kri'zz defenses. This crude projectile, it's so technologically backward that it registers as space debris. By the time the Kri'zz recognize it as a threat, the agent has already begun its work." The Admiralty Board fell into stunned silence as they watched the remains of the Kri'zz fragment dissipate into harmless dust. "A Trojan horse," Lieutenant Kri'zz said suddenly, database knowledge clicking into place. "A reference from human military history, a deception concealed within a seemingly harmless or inferior package." "Exactly," the human confirmed. "Sometimes the best technology isn't the newest, it's the one your enemy has forgotten to defend against." High Commander Vrelk's compound eyes reflected the disintegrating crystal. "Can this weapon be scaled? The Kri'zz collective spans star systems." "Already done," the human replied, tapping the side of the massive weapon. "This baby can deliver payloads large enough to seed an entire Kri'zz fleet. The reaction is self-propagating once it reaches critical mass. As they consume each other to grow, they'll spread our little molecular surprise throughout their entire collective." Grand Admiral Vrextul's epidermis shifted slowly from skeptical ultraviolet to impressed infrared. "You disguised an advanced molecular agent in a primitive delivery system, knowing the very primitiveness would be its greatest asset." "Sometimes," the human said, patting the crude weapon with obvious affection, "the best way to beat a chess master isn't with better chess. It's by flipping the board and suggesting a game of poker instead." As the final fragments of the Kri'zz crystal dissolved into nothingness, the observation deck erupted in a chorus of approval that transcended species barriers. Even the Grand Admiral's epidermis glowed with grudging respect. Lieutenant Kri'zz leaned toward Commander Vrelk. "I believe the human expression is 'I told you so.'" Vrelk's mandibles clicked in what might have been the Vexillian equivalent of a chuckle. "Indeed. Perhaps there is something to be said for thinking inside a box so old that it appears new again." The shockwave of the weapon's success rippled through Confederate space faster than any quantum transmission. Within 12 hours, the inevitable mathematical conclusion transformed from a vessel of quiet desperation to the epicenter of frenzied activity. Crew members who had previously regarded the human with barely concealed disdain now manufactured reasons to pass nearby, offering gestures their species considered respectful. "Your social status appears to have undergone significant recalibration," Captain Kri'zz observed as they escorted the human through corridors suddenly filled with saluting officers. "Nothing succeeds like success," the human replied, with that peculiar facial configuration the database had finally categorized as wry amusement. "Yesterday, I was a backwards primate. Today, I'm a tactical genius. Tomorrow, who knows?" In the Grand Strategic Chamber, Confederate military leadership gathered around holographic projections displaying real-time production statistics. Manufacturing hubs throughout Allied space had received design specifications for what official communiques termed the molecular lattice disruption system. But what everyone, including, surprisingly, the Grand Admiral, had begun calling the hammer. Production capacity has been maximized, reported Fleet Commander Zex Nivuran, who had mysteriously replaced Admiral Zex Torrell after the latter's sudden reassignment to monitor a gas giant in the remotest sector of Confederate space. First-wave deployment vessels will be fully equipped within 6 rotations. The human studied the logistics projections, occasionally suggesting modifications that the Confederate engineers implemented with uncharacteristic humility. Where once there had been condescension, now there was attentiveness bordering on reverence. "The molecular agent has been refined," announced the science minister, tendrils vibrating with what could only be described as scientific excitement. Propagation velocity increased by 42%, with enhanced penetration of secondary lattice structures. Grand Admiral Vrextjul, whose epidermis now glowed a respectful amber when addressing the human, manipulated the tactical display. "We have plotted intercept trajectories with the main Kri'zz fleet at these coordinates. Conservative projections suggest we could neutralize their advance guard with the first wave of equipped vessels." The human nodded, studying the holographic battle plans with an expression that made Captain Crack's translator implant struggle between professional satisfaction and existential melancholy. "Something troubles you?" High Commander Vrelk inquired, mandibles clicking softly. "Just contemplating cosmic irony," the human replied. "My species spent millennia perfecting the art of killing each other. Now those same destructive instincts might save your civilization." Vrelk's compound eyes adjusted focus thoughtfully. "Perhaps what makes a predator dangerous also makes them an invaluable guardian. The universe seldom rewards those unable to defend themselves." The first battle reports arrived during third shift. The strategic chamber filled beyond capacity as officers abandoned sleep cycles to witness history. The holographic display showed Confederate vessels engaging a Kri'zz scouting fleet at extreme range. The crystalline ships, accustomed to energy weapons they could adapt to within moments, made no evasive maneuvers as the primitive projectiles approached. Silence engulfed the chamber as they watched the molecular agent take effect. Kri'zz vessels began losing structural integrity, their perfect geometric forms developing irregularities that spread like fracture lines across ice. Within moments, what had been deadly sentient weapons dissolved into clouds of inert particles. "By the primal equations," whispered someone, breaking the stunned silence. Throughout the next rotation, reports flooded in from all engagement zones. Confederate forces, emboldened by their sudden advantage, pressed forward against the now vulnerable Kri'zz. The crystalline collective, for the first time since its emergence, was in full retreat. "The most elegant aspect," the science minister reported, tendrils coiling with undisguised pleasure, "is how the Kri'zz unwittingly accelerate their own defeat. Their communication network, crystalline resonance across their collective, transmits the corrupted pattern when they attempt to coordinate. They're spreading our virus for us," the human translated with a grim satisfaction that even the translator recognized as complex and layered. "Sometimes, the best strategy is letting your enemy defeat themselves." By the 8th rotation, the Kri'zz threat had been neutralized across 3 sectors. By the 12th, the collective had been reduced to isolated fragments that posed no significant danger. The 18 threatened colonies were safe, and the Confederacy had acquired a newfound respect for what they now called unconventional tactical perspectives. In recognition of this unprecedented victory, the Supreme Council convened a ceremony aboard the flagship. The quantum architecture of the Grand Hall reconfigured itself to accommodate representatives from every saved colony, their diverse biologies requiring environmental fields that made the air shimmer with protective barriers. The humans stood before the Supreme Arbiter, visibly uncomfortable in the ceremonial attire that had been specifically fabricated for the occasion. Around their neck materialized the holographic medallion representing the Order of the Seventh Spiral, the highest honor in Confederate space. "For service beyond expectation or precedent," intoned the Supreme Arbiter, their voice resonating through perfect acoustics, "we recognize this representative of Earth. Additionally, the Confederacy formally extends an invitation to Earth to join our alliance as an associate member, with full technological exchange privileges." The assembled dignitaries expressed approval through their species' diverse methods, from bioluminescent pulses to subsonic rumbles that made the deck plates vibrate. "On behalf of Earth, I accept with gratitude," the human replied, managing a reasonable approximation of Confederate formal syntax. "Though perhaps you should be selective about which of our technologies you adopt. Some are considerably more primitive than what you've witnessed." At the reception afterward, where refreshments incompatible with numerous biochemistries were carefully segregated, Captain Kri'zz found the human gazing out at the stars through the massive viewport. "You seem contemplative rather than celebratory," Kri'zz observed. The human's expression shifted to something the database now identified as philosophical amusement. "I'm thinking about the lessons here. Your civilization achieved wonders we can barely comprehend, yet it was our stubborn attachment to throwing things really hard that saved the day." "Perhaps," suggested Kri'zz. "Advanced civilizations sometimes evolve past certain useful instincts. We became so focused on elegant solutions that we forgot the virtue of straightforward approaches." High Commander Vrelk joined them, his mandibles relaxed, in what Kri'zz recognized as contentment. "The Science Ministry has initiated a comprehensive review of ancient Confederate weapon systems. It seems we may have been too eager to abandon certain methodologies in our pursuit of technological sophistication." "Sometimes," the human replied, "the oldest tools are still the best ones." Across Confederate space, manufacturing facilities continued producing what were essentially glorified cannons, ancient principles of warfare wrapped in quantum-age delivery systems. The elegant mathematics of progressive civilization had been supplemented by the brutal practicality of beings who had evolved throwing rocks at problems before developing equations. The Confederate Military Academy updated its core curriculum with a new principle, attributed to human tactical philosophy. "Advancement without retention creates vulnerability." Tactical officers would debate its implications for generations. As the celebration continued around them, the human raised a glass of synthesized earth beverage to unlikely solutions and to valuable perspectives, Vrelk replied, attempting the human toast gesture with moderate success. Beyond the viewport, stars scattered across the void like crystal fragments. Somewhere out there, the remnants of the Kri'zz collective retreated, their perfect harmony disrupted by a weapon conceived by beings who had mastered the art of destruction long before they mastered the laws of physics. In the flagship's database, a new entry appeared in the tactical archives. The most dangerous enemy is not the most advanced, but the one whose approach you cannot anticipate. Sometimes the primitive solution is the one your defenses are not designed to counter.